Now, WTOC presents Savannah Remembers, the Battle of the Bulge.
One of the deepest winters in European history. It was a bone-chilling cold that the Southerners hated even more than they hated the Nazis. Christmas was near, but the year 1944 would forever change the meaning of Christmas for more than 250,000 American GIs, caught up in the German offensive known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. These men were there. Olin Burnside, Joe Martin, Calvin Weeks, infantrymen Sid Waldhauer. From the 230th Field Artillery, Joe Russell, Earl Kirkley and Marvin Heery from the 118th, along with Corporal Eddie Susevich. Billy Jones fought at St. Vith, George Paxton at Malmedy. Colonel Charles Connor was with the 335th. Hunter SAUSSY was in General Bradley's Intelligence Division. Bill Kennedy was one of the battered bastards of Bastogne. The kind face of Gordon Rogers was well placed as a medic. Billy Bacon, a foot soldier, fighting the Germans hand-to-hand, and Vidalia's DeWitt Sharpe was part of a unit most surprised by the German sneak attack, the ill-fated 106th Infantry. The offensive that now found these Americans on the frozen threshold to Germany had begun a short 7 months before on the beaches of France. D-Day's battles had been hard fought with thousands of casualties attending the Allied thrust into Europe. But after the Allied breakout, the rout was on as the Americans chased the Wehrmacht back across the plains of Europe.
It wasn't until we broke out at St. Lo that we actually began to move. Then we moved real fast.
In some instances, the GIs moved too fast for the supply lines, which stretched back to the recently taken French beaches. Eisenhower knew that he'd have to secure Antwerp as an interior port before any thrust into Germany would be practicable.
It was touch and go as long as our supplies would last. Then we had a weather problem. We had problems getting our ammunition. We had problems getting gasoline.
They were pulling out as fast as they could go, and we were trying to catch them. The Germans were trying to get back to the Siegfried Line and save as much of their army as they could. Stop us there. Of course, we were doing all that time. We were running out of supplies and everything else. I mean, the further we got from the seacoast, the harder it was to supply the armies.
As the U.S. began its approach and initial penetration of Germany, major battles continued to be fought at Aachen, Hürtgen Forest, and Ruhr Dams. But in every maneuver, Eisenhower predicated his strategy on a telling formula: enemy losses must double our own.
I just felt, well, these just can't go on forever. So I said, well, we can get hurt, but I think that in the long run they will be hurt worse.
It was rumored among the Allies that Ike had bet British Commander Montgomery £5 that the war would be over by Christmas. It was a bet Ike would lose.
But there were rough times between the personalities involved at command level, between Montgomery and Eisenhower, between Montgomery and Patton, between Montgomery and Bradley, and so forth. And Hitler sensed this, and he figured if he could break the Allied lines in two, he could sue for peace in the West.
The middle of the American front stalled when it reached the frontier of Germany, but fighting continued on the flanks.
Patton was still attacking in the south, along in the Saar area. First Army was going to attack in the north, along the Ruhr Downs. In between was the Ardennes.
There on the border behind the Siegfried lines, the Germans had fixed guns, obstacles, and pillboxes. Eisenhower stopped his troops in a safe haven in front of the Ardennes forest, a thick Belgian wood that he reckoned to be impassable for the badly beaten Germans.
everybody was of the opinion that the German army was finished. You had supremacy of the air, everything else. When you moved when you wanted to move. The Germans could not replace the things that they were losing. And I don't believe possibly maybe a handful knew that they had been hoarding this stuff for this last massive drive to try to break through the port of Antwerp.
They told us to dig in, we were in northern Germany, and get comfortable because we weren't going to move until spring.
This was a heavily wooded area, and they pulled the ones that had been there doing nothing, and it was quite a lull in the battle. We were around Aachen, Germany, and there was a lull in the combat offensives, so they put these new divisions in there and pulled the seasoned people back. There was really nothing to do than what he thought. But the Germans had checked it out pretty closely and figured that was the best place to break through, and it was. They couldn't have done that anyplace else.
They called the American side of the Ardennes the Ghost Front, so deadly quiet and foggy was the scene. But the silence would soon be shattered as the Americans played into Hitler's hands.
We could look down up on this mountain range and in the forest and look down into Prum, Germany, which was about 10 or 15 miles down the mountain range in front of our positions. And for weeks and weeks and months, we kept sending back information, intelligence information, that the Germans were massing troops. They were unloading tanks. This was a huge railroad center. We had a feeling something was going to happen, but we didn't dare think that it was going to come right through there. We were there 2.5 months, and we left on the 11th of December, and we pulled out and went north into Belgium to take the Rohr dams. The 106th Division, brand new division from the States, came in and took over our position, which was about 12 or 15 miles wide. They were thinly scattered, just like we were and all. And had we been there, we would have gotten the same punishment that they got. They were only in combat 4 days before the Battle of the Bulge. They lasted 3 days after the Battle of the Bulge, and the 106 was destroyed.
We were under a terrific barrage there for a while. And then the foot soldiers came on in. It's just like all hell broke loose. We were afraid. It was our first time in combat. We didn't know what to do. We were lost. Some of us crying, some praying, some running. We didn't know which way to turn.
It could not be done, but he had just done it. Hitler's troops had crossed the forest and marched headlong into history as the Americans fell back under the weight of the Nazi bulge.
We were sitting there, and the boys, we were seldom through the meal, and I picked up one of the Stars and Stripes and looked at it, and I said, Captain, I know that sign says Normandy, Belgium down there we come by, but what's the name of that town? He said, it's Normandy. Why? I said, well, somebody better tell them. Look at the headlines, Normandy in enemy hands.
On the morning of December the 16th, Field Marshal von Rundstedt sent his troops across the woods to rout the Americans and drive to Antwerp. Suddenly, the European front had become liquid, confused and volatile. The GIs lashed out in every direction as they sought to control the bleeding of their ruptured middle.
We didn't know exactly what was taking place. You could hear all kinds of rumors, but we had to continue on. And so we left our secure place and we went into where they thought we were needed most. I remember the night quite vividly. The Germans kept the skies illuminated, trying to see or to hinder, and also, I guess, for information to see what the American troops were doing.
We started south. We rode all that day until, well after dark, and we knew we were getting close because we quit seeing civilians and didn't see any lights from any buildings, and we knew that we were getting pretty close. About 11 o'clock that night, we were standing on the side of the road, and a soldier ran up to our regimental commander and said, "Colonel, there's a Tiger tank right around that bend." And the colonel said, "How far around the bend?" He said, "About 50 yards. So he turned to Colonel Seawright and said, "Pat, bring your guns up and dig them in. This is where we stop them."
And of course there were pamphlets all over the town. There were pamphlets up on the trees and the posts and laying in the buildings, and these pamphlets said, "Welcome, men of the 134th Infantry 35th Division." Said, "You are facing some of the same jerries you face in the southern part of France." Said, "You know us, we're quite some fighters. That it's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight."
The Germans had struck at an opportune hour. The snow and fog grounded the American planes and kept them on the ground for 9 agonizing days. American lines were stretched too thin. The men in the middle were routed, and Allied intelligence was forced to grope with a situation they had not foreseen.
At first, they thought that probably it was just a spoiling attack to slow down Patton's attack in the south. But when the 6th SS Panzer Army showed up in the attack, then they knew that it was a big thing. Legion of Merit was given to me by Eisenhower.
Hunter SAUSSY was a lieutenant colonel in the 12th Army, assigned to gather intelligence for General Bradley. Working with the British, SAUSSY's team had broken the German communications code, and from D-Day on were intercepting enemy orders even before the German generals got them. But says SAUSSY, that all changed when the Nazis reached the fatherland.
When we were in Normandy, the Germans had to go on the air for all of their orders and things, operations and things, because they felt and they knew their landlines were not secure, that the French underground was tapping them and getting the information. But they felt that their top-level, top-secret signals, radios, couldn't be broken. The codes couldn't be broken. Well, they were mistaken because the British were breaking them every night. When they got back on the Siegfried line, they didn't have to go on the air with the orders. The landlines were secure there, and they were in friendly country. So we didn't get a lot of the operational orders that we were getting prior to that time when we were in Normandy.
Even from that disadvantaged position, Allied intelligence was still good.
We knew where every division in the German army on the front was.
But not good enough to predict the point of attack.
We knew they could attack, didn't know that they would. Intelligence is a study of enemy capabilities, not intentions.
To further complicate matters for our troops, the Germans had infiltrated our lines and disguised themselves as GIs, thereby threatening every soldier and unit in the lines.
At the beginning of their counterattack, they flooded the whole area with paratroopers.
The worst part of the infiltration was that the infantry, the men in the dirt, had to give up their overcoats to keep from being confused with the German spies.
Germans had captured some of the warehouses when that breakthrough, and they were using the overcoats to infiltrate into American lines to look like Americans who tried to deceive them. And the only way that they could figure to stop it was just nobody wore an overcoat. Anybody had an overcoat on and get shot.
The cold. Talk to any veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, and he'll tell you about the bitter cold of that Belgian December and the incredible suffering it inflicted, as much suffering as the enemy himself.
And you never got away from it. You were out there day after day after day in that cold.
I was to report to the 2nd Battalion Commander of the 119th Infantry as a forward observer. He said, "Son, go back to your outfit. These boys are too cold to fight." He said, "We're going to walk down this hill into that town, and if they get killed, they'll just have to get killed."
The frigid condition brought with them a particular peril for the GIs, trench foot and frostbite. The two combined to cause thousands of casualties for the soldiers pinned down in icy Europe. The soft snow also served as a final resting place for scores of Americans massacred at the Belgian town of Malmedy. For the boys of Savannah, it was the most gripping moment of the war.
They overran the division that was there, and they had, I forget how many, whether it was 50, 60, 75, 100, I don't know, but there was GIs that were captured in this one group. And this colonel, who was later tried in the war trials, he gave the command to shoot them. And so they were shot with machine guns from the top of a tank and left in this open field.
They lay in this field and were frozen solid, and I can remember going after the battle and things had settled down, going over and seeing these bodies stacked like so much cordwood, just one on top of each other, waiting to be transported to the rear.
Those memories, carried for 50 years, are still vivid in the minds of the Savannah soldiers, who recall all too well the pain of the Battle of the Bulge.
Even though it was war, and you could hear a distance and you hear the cannon, a bunch of us got a flatbed, and we got out in the middle of that little town that we were in, and we started singing Christmas carols. It was very touching.
Nuts. That's the famous reply given by General McCulloch when the Germans demanded that he surrender at Bastogne. He was surrounded and threatened with annihilation. But his resolve still stands as a high watermark of American determination. Savannah's Bill Kennedy was at Bastogne during the siege, part of the 101st Airborne that beat the Germans to the critical intersection that was key to the transportation of troops, a town that the German commander promised would be taken.
They must have cut us off on the 20th, and we were cut off until the 26th. And when they did encircle, they captured the division medical unit, the division quartermaster unit. So with that went the medical treatment and the resupply.
101st Airborne Division was a very fine American unit, the Screaming Eagles. And they dug in at Bastogne, and they took everything that the Germans could give them.
He said that he was going to destroy the town. Why, I don't think there was a village or a home in Noville that hadn't been hit when we were in Noville. And when we got back to Bastogne, I don't think there was a house that hadn't been hit with either a shell or shrapnel. But he didn't have this amount of artillery that he said he had.
But the Germans did have the artillery to decimate the battered bastards of Bastogne. At the end of the siege, Kennedy's troops were a fraction of their original strength of 160 men.
When we went down to the Ruhr Pocket, I had 55 men in the company. I company had 21 men.
The determination of Bastogne was reinforced by the incomparable abilities of General George S. Patton, who responded to the surrounded village in unprecedented time and fashion.
Patton was the only commander that could take his forces, as he did, 100 miles under absolutely dreadful conditions, and have them arrive at Bastogne with guns blazing.
Patton, together with the 101st, turned the tide of the entire Battle of the Bulge and signaled a wholesale improvement of American fortunes. The weather cleared, and the planes could fly. And German fuel, a critical element from the beginning, was now exhausted, as our troops would later learn.
The Germans had used oxen to pull some of their tanks in position to fight because they were running out of gas. And they used oxen to pull their equipment into a fighting position, and those dead animals were still on the ground there, frozen stiff, of course.
The lesson of Bastogne was unmistakable.
When we held Bastogne and the Germans realized that they were going to have to go back to Germany, they realized definitely that they were beaten.
Across the front, the Americans began to push back against the Germans, and it was clear that the Germans had all of the fight taken out of them.
That was the last German offensive of the war. It took all of their reserves to mount it, only to suffer massively.
But we got so many actually surrendering along the last days there until we would find one that could speak English, and we'd point out to him and show him on the map where the prisoner collection point and send the platoon on back by themselves. I mean,
the Fuhrer would last only a few months more, but his last days were certainly plagued by the great mistake that he made by prosecuting the Battle of the Bulge.
The experiences people had and enjoyed, working and living and fighting close to each other, made a bond that will always exist.
It was over. The Nazis were pushed back into Germany. But not before more American casualties were spent than ever before in history. 8,000 dead, 48,000 wounded, 21,000 captured or missing. For the Germans, casualties were almost double those figures. But for the rest of the world, the Bulge meant that the quiet assurance that had marked the lives before the advent of Hitler would soon return.
When the Ardennes offensive was over in the middle of January, Hitler had no more gambles. He had no more reserves to throw in. And the Western Front collapsed. The Eastern Front collapsed in a matter of 5 months. Hitler was dead by his own hand. This was a battle that was almost exclusively American. The troops that did the fighting and the dying and the freezing were mostly American troops.
50 years ago, on December the 16th, it all started. 50 years ago, the men that you've heard tonight were there in freezing cold and flying shrapnel. Well, tonight we honor them and those lost in the Belgian forest as Savannah remembers the Battle of the Bulge.